On my wedding day, my father betrayed me, skipping my ceremony to celebrate my stepbrother's event instead. While I was left to cover all my wedding expenses, my stepmother secretly schemed to steal my $70 million inheritance for her son, with my father's full support. But they didn't see what was coming. By the next morning, as they woke up, they were blindsided by a revenge so shocking, it turned their world upside down. My name is Dorothy, and I've always been someone who believed in family. I used to think my dad was my hero, a man who could do no wrong. Growing up in Austin, Texas, I had a happy childhood. My parents, Richard and Clara, were loving and supportive, and life was simple. My dad taught me how to ride a bike, cheered me on at school recitals, and made sure I felt special in every way. But things changed when I was 14. I still remember the day my parents sat me down in our cozy living room to tell me they were getting a divorce. My mom had discovered my dad was having an affair. The woman's name was Sarah, and she worked in real estate. I didn't know how to feel. My world shattered that day, and I clung to my mom as we moved out of the house. I thought maybe my dad and I could still be close, but that was wishful thinking. 6 months after the divorce, Dad married Sarah. I tried to be open-minded, I really did. Sarah seemed nice at first. She had a son, Liam, who was just a couple of years younger than me. At 28 now, he's an aspiring musician, but back then, he was just the new kid in my life. I thought maybe we could bond as a family, but it didn't take long for Sarah's true colors to show. Sarah was always controlling. She made decisions about everything in my dad's life, including me. I went from being the center of his world to feeling like an afterthought. I noticed it in small ways at first. He'd miss our movie nights because Sarah needed him to do something. Then it became bigger things, like skipping my birthday dinner to attend Liam's baseball game. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd remember I was his daughter. But as the years went by, it only got worse. By the time I was 18, it was clear that Sarah had all but replaced me in my father's life. Dad would shower Liam with gifts and attention, and Sarah encouraged it. Liam wanted to be a musician, and my dad spent thousands of dollars on lessons, equipment, and studio time for him. Meanwhile, I worked part-time jobs to save for college. I didn't mind working hard for what I wanted, but it hurt knowing my dad wouldn't help me the same way he helped Liam. I thought things might improve when I graduated college and started working as a marketing manager at a local firm. I even hoped Dad might finally notice the woman I had become. But when I introduced him to Jake, the love of my life, it was like he barely cared. Jake is an architect, smart and kind, and everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. My dad gave him a polite handshake and quickly changed the subject to talk about Liam's latest performance. Then came the wedding planning. Jake proposed to me on a beautiful spring morning during a hike, and I couldn't have been happier. We set the date for October 15th and started making arrangements. We sent out invitations 6 months in advance so everyone could plan, including Dad and Sarah. I even hoped this could be a chance to reconnect with my father. But that hope was short-lived. 2 months before the wedding, I found out that Liam had scheduled his music debut on the exact same day. It wasn't just a coincidence. He had known our wedding date. When I confronted my dad about it, I'll never forget his words. Liam's event is important too, Dorothy. Maybe you could change your date. Your venue is more flexible. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wedding wasn't just a random event. It was one of the most important days of my life.
But my dad didn't see it that way.
He even offered to pay for Liam's event while refusing to contribute to my wedding. It was like a slap in the face. I stood my ground, refusing to change the date, but the damage was done. The betrayal didn't end there. On my wedding day, Dad, Sarah, and Liam didn't show up. They were too busy hosting Liam's music event to bother attending my ceremony. My grandfather, Edward, who's always been my rock, stepped in to walk me down the aisle. Edward is a retired school principal, a man of integrity, and he's been there for me through everything. He gave me the strength to smile through the heartbreak. But that day wasn't just about betrayal. It was also the beginning of something bigger. After the wedding, I overheard Sarah boasting about how they planned to secure my grandfather's ranch and my father's assets for Liam. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a missed wedding. It was about a calculated effort to cut me out of the family altogether. I didn't know it then, but that discovery would set me on a path I never expected to take. A path of uncovering secrets, seeking justice, and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. This was only the beginning of my story, and I was about to learn just how far betrayal could go. After my wedding, I tried to focus on my new life with Jake, but I couldn't shake the sting of what had happened. My own father, the man I had once seen as my hero, had chosen my stepbrother Liam over me. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about everything that had led up to it. The favoritism, the dismissiveness, and Sarah's ever-tightening grip on my father. I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation I overheard at the reception. Sarah had been speaking to one of her friends, laughing as she talked about how she and Liam would soon have everything they wanted. "The ranch is practically ours," she said. "Once Richard finalizes the paperwork, there won't be anything left for Dorothy." Hearing those words was like a punch to the gut. The ranch she was talking about belonged to my grandfather Edward. It had been in our family for generations, and he always said it would go to me someday. But now it seemed like Sarah had other plans. I knew she had always been manipulative, but this was a new low. I couldn't let it go. That night, Jake and I stayed up talking. I told him everything, the favoritism, the betrayal, and Sarah's scheming. He held my hand and said, "Dorothy, you have to do something about this. You can't let them take what's yours." Jake was right. I wasn't going to sit back and let Sarah and Liam destroy what little family legacy I had left. The next morning, I went to see my grandfather. Edward greeted me with his warm smile, the same one that had comforted me through so many tough times. We sat on the porch of his ranch, the Texas sun shining down on us, as I told him everything. He listened quietly, his face growing more serious with every word. When I finished, he nodded and said, "Dorothy, I've suspected for a while that Sarah was up to no good, but I didn't realize it had gone this far." Edward told me that he had noticed strange behavior from Richard lately, avoiding family gatherings, making excuses for Sarah's actions, and even asking odd questions about the ranch's ownership. Edward had dismissed it as Richard being under Sarah's thumb, but now he saw it for what it was, a coordinated effort to take control of the family's assets. We decided to dig deeper. With Jake's help, we began gathering evidence. I started with my father's financial records, which wasn't easy to access, but Edward had an old friend who worked in banking and owed him a favor. What we found was shocking. Large sums of money had been transferred from my father's accounts to Sarah and Liam's joint account. It was clear that Sarah had been funneling my dad's wealth to fund Liam's music career. But that wasn't the worst of it. We discovered that Sarah and Liam had forged Richard's signature on several documents, including one that attempted to transfer partial ownership of the ranch to Liam. My stomach churned as I realized the lengths they were willing to go. They weren't just trying to cut me out, they were trying to steal everything. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to confront my father. I couldn't do it alone, though. Jake and Edward agreed to come with me for support. We went to my dad's house one evening, and when he opened the door, he looked surprised to see me. "Dorothy," he said, his voice cautious. "What's going on?" I stepped inside, my heart pounding. "We need to talk, Dad," I said firmly. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her usual smug expression on her face. Liam was there too, strumming his guitar like he didn't have a care in the world. "What's this about?" Sarah asked, feigning innocence. I took a deep breath and laid the evidence on the table. The bank records, the forged documents, everything. "This is about you stealing from my family," I said, my voice shaking with anger. Sarah's face twisted into a scowl. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Liam tried to play it cool, shrugging and saying, "This is ridiculous. You're just bitter because Dad chose to support me." My father sat in stunned silence, staring at the documents. "Is this true, Sarah?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned on me. "You've always been jealous of Liam," she snapped. "You couldn't stand to see someone else get attention, so you're trying to ruin us." I couldn't believe the audacity. "This isn't about jealousy," I said. This is about you manipulating my father and trying to steal what doesn't belong to you. My dad stood up, his hands trembling as he looked at Sarah. You told me these were just routine papers, he said. You told me. His voice broke, and for the first time, I saw genuine regret in his eyes. What have I done? Sarah didn't try to deny it anymore. Instead, she turned defensive, accusing me of trying to tear the family apart. Liam joined in, saying I was just being selfish. But their words didn't matter. I had the truth, and now my father saw it too. The confrontation ended with my dad asking Sarah and Liam to leave the house. They protested, of course, but he was firm. I could see the pain in his eyes as he realized how blind he'd been, but I wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. That night, as I sat with Jake and Edward, I felt a mix of emotions: relief that the truth was out, anger at everything Sarah and Liam had done, and sadness for the father I had lost to their lies. But I also felt a spark of determination. This wasn't over. Not yet. The confrontation with my dad had been exhausting, but it was far from the end. Sarah and Liam might have been kicked out of his house, but I knew they weren't done. If anything, they'd double down now that they'd been exposed. I couldn't let my guard down, not with everything I'd uncovered so far. The morning after the confrontation, Jake, Grandpa Edward, and I sat down to review the evidence again. We needed to ensure we hadn't missed anything. As we sifted through bank statements, emails, and legal documents, a disturbing pattern emerged. Sarah wasn't just controlling my dad. She'd been manipulating him for years, slowly isolating him from the rest of the family, while draining his resources. Edward leaned back in his chair, his face stern. Dorothy, this isn't just about greed. This is about control. Sarah saw Richard as her way to secure her son's future, no matter the cost.
He was right.
Sarah had systematically dismantled my father's relationships, starting with me. Every missed recital, every ignored birthday, it was all part of her plan to make Liam the sole focus of my dad's life. And now, with their sights set on the ranch and my father's remaining assets, they weren't going to back off easily. Later that week, I received a call from my cousin, Laura. She had been at a recent family gathering and overheard Sarah talking to someone about selling the ranch. Dorothy, I don't know the details, Laura said, her voice worried, but it sounded like she's already looking for buyers. I felt my stomach drop. The ranch wasn't hers to sell. It wasn't even my father's to sell. It belonged to Edward. But the thought of Sarah even trying was enough to send me into a panic. I immediately called Edward, who reassured me that no transactions had taken place. But it shows how desperate they are, he said. We need to act fast. At Jake's suggestion, we hired a lawyer to protect Edward's property legally. We secured the ranch under a trust in my name, ensuring Sarah and Liam couldn't touch it. While it gave us some peace of mind, it also painted a target on my back. Sarah and Liam wouldn't take this lying down. Sure enough, the next move came quickly. One evening, while Jake and I were going over wedding photos, I received an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "You're not as safe as you think." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sentence: "If you think this is over, you're wrong." I felt a chill run down my spine. Jake immediately called our lawyer, who advised us to document everything. We filed a police report, but there wasn't much they could do without knowing who sent the email. Still, the message was clear. Sarah and Liam were trying to intimidate me. The next few weeks were tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting them to show up or try something drastic. And then it happened. One night, as Jake and I were returning from dinner, we found Liam sitting in his car outside our house. He wasn't alone, Sarah was with him. "What are you doing here?" I demanded as I approached their car. Sarah rolled down the window, her face cold and calculating. "We're here to talk," she said. "You've made things very difficult for us, Dorothy." "Difficult for you?" I snapped. "You tried to steal from my family, from my grandfather. What do you want?" Liam leaned forward, smirking. "You're so dramatic. We just want what's fair."
You don't need that ranch, Dorothy.
"It's too much for you to handle. Dad always said it should go to the person who can make the most of it." I couldn't believe their audacity. "Fair," I said, my voice rising. You mean stealing everything I've ever loved and worked for? You've been leeching off my dad for years, and now you think you can bully me into giving you what's not yours. Sarah's smirk faded, replaced by a glare. You're making a mistake, Dorothy. We're family, and family should share. Family? I said, my voice shaking with anger. You don't know the first thing about family. Jake stepped forward, his voice firm. This conversation is over. If you don't leave, we're calling the police. Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but Liam pulled her back. Let's go, he muttered. They drove off, but the tension lingered long after they were gone. That night, I realized just how far they were willing to go. They weren't just trying to intimidate me, they wanted to break me. But I wasn't going to let them. I had come too far to back down now. The fight wasn't over yet, but I was ready for whatever came next. After Liam and Sarah showed up outside my house, I knew the time had come to end this once and for all. Their boldness was terrifying, but it also fueled my determination. They had already caused so much damage, and I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me or my family. The next morning, Jake, Grandpa Edward, and I met with our lawyer to finalize the protective measures for the ranch. Edward was surprisingly calm for someone whose legacy had been under siege. Dorothy, he said, his voice steady, these people thrive on fear. The best way to beat them is to stand firm and let the truth do the work. That night, however, they tried something new. I received another email, this one containing a threat. It said if I didn't relinquish the ranch, they would expose personal details about my life to the public. It was laughable, they had nothing on me, but the fact they were resorting to blackmail showed how desperate they were. Instead of panicking, I forwarded the email to our lawyer and Jake, who both agreed it was time to take stronger action. I decided to file for a restraining order against both Sarah and Liam. It wasn't easy. The process involved presenting all the evidence we had collected, emails, their appearances outside my house, and testimonies from Jake and Edward. The judge granted the restraining order, which felt like a small victory, but I knew it wouldn't be the end. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I received a call from my dad, Richard. It was late at night, and his voice sounded strained. Dorothy, he said, I need to see you. Please, it's important. I hesitated. My father had been manipulated for so long that I didn't know if I could trust him. But something in his voice made me agree.
Fine, I said.
But we're meeting at Grandpa's ranch. When he arrived, he looked like a shadow of the man I used to know. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. Dorothy, he began, I've made a terrible mistake. I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. You've made plenty, Dad. Which one are you talking about? He sighed heavily and sat down on the porch steps. Sarah and Liam, they've been lying to me for years. After you confronted us, I started digging into the finances. They've drained me, Dorothy. I'm nearly broke. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But then I remembered everything he had done, or failed to do, to protect me. And now you want my help? I asked, my voice cold. After everything they've put me through? He shook his head. No, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to make things right. He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were more documents, bank statements, contracts, and emails. It was a treasure trove of evidence against Sarah and Liam. What is this? I asked. It's everything I have, he said. Proof of how they manipulated me, forged my signature, and stole from me.
Use it however you need to.
I just want to stop them. It was a shocking moment. For the first time in years, my father was standing up to Sarah and Liam. But I wasn't ready to trust him completely. Why now? I asked. Why not years ago, when they started tearing this family apart? He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. Because I was a coward. I let them control me, because I didn't want to lose them. But I see now that I lost you instead, and I can't live with that. I took the folder and nodded. Thank you. But don't think this fixes everything. The next day, armed with the new evidence, I met with our lawyer and Edward. Together, we built an airtight case against Sarah and Liam. We filed charges of fraud, forgery, and theft, and the authorities moved quickly. Within days, Sarah and Liam were served with legal papers. But they didn't go quietly. Liam took to social media, accusing me of being a gold-digging daughter who turned her family against him. Sarah made similar claims to anyone who would listen. It was ugly, but I refused to engage. The truth was on my side, and I let the legal system handle the rest. In the end, justice prevailed. Sarah and Liam were found guilty of fraud and forgery, and they were ordered to repay everything they had stolen. The court also barred them from coming within 100 yards of me, Jake, or Edward. The ranch was safe, and so was my future. As for my dad, he tried to rebuild our relationship. I allowed him small steps, but the trust we once had was gone. It would take years to heal, if it ever did. Jake and I moved into the ranch full-time, starting a new chapter of our lives. Edward was thrilled to see the property thriving again, and he and Jake bonded over the renovations. I often think about what might have happened if I had stayed silent, if I had let Sarah and Liam win. But then I remember the strength I found in standing up for myself and my family. Betrayal may have scarred me, but it didn't break me. In the end, I proved that justice and resilience can overcome even the deepest wounds.